It's spring and you want to hike, bike, hit up the farmer's market, but the last thing you want to do on a warm, sunny morning is clean house. That's where Greenland Pro Cleaning comes in. They're eco-friendly, allergy-friendly, and locally owned in Asheville. Listeners of The Overlook get a free upholstery and refrigerator cleaning upgrade with their first booking. Just use the code PODCAST at checkout. Make the most of your time this spring and visit greenlandprocleaning.com/overlook.
I am a maker, a builder, a baker, although sometimes my messes are all that you'll find. I'll tell a story, both true and allegory. Oh, the process is precious, so it takes up all my time.
Pete Candler wears many creative hats. He's a photographer and maker of short films, all of it self-taught, and he's also an author and recovering academic.
I think early on when I started, I certainly didn't have a sense of myself as a photographer. I think I just shot pictures I thought looked cool. I started to look at my own pictures differently. They came back to me in a way and they revealed something that I didn't see the first time.
This is The Overlook with Matt Peiken, a podcast about the news, arts, issues, and trends of Asheville, North Carolina. We'll talk with Candler about his new book titled A Deeper South. He sees it as both an internal and external travelogue over 25 years of road trips through the American South. We'll also talk about leaving a tenured professorship at Baylor University to pursue his creative impulses and why he has always been drawn to photographing places rather than people. Candler also reveals a family history too close for comfort to the vestiges of slavery. Pete Candler is originally from Atlanta, and he went to college in Wake Forest, North Carolina. He'd already begun making trips into the South when he began teaching at Baylor. I began our conversation by asking why he left his tenured position after 10 years there to move to Asheville and dive into his traveling and the writing and photography that comes from it.
When I first left academia, no, the project that I'm working on now didn't materialize until later. I had this wild idea that I wanted to leave academia, write fiction, and move our family back to the Southeast where my wife and I are both from. And, of course, you have these images in your head that, oh, I'll write a novel. It will become moderately successful. It will allow me to live like the life of an artist. That didn't happen, which will surprise no one listening to this. But ultimately, the story of how A Deeper South emerged was its own kind of set of convergences that I could never really have predicted. But I left academia because I ultimately found that it wasn't really a good fit for me. I felt like I was not really a scholar. I loved doing research. I loved being around libraries. I enjoyed teaching. I loved this sort of vibe of a university community. And I could, at one point, imagine myself being in that world for the rest of my life and being perfectly happy. And like everything, maybe your experience in journalism was like this. The reality, once you get inside it, is quite different. And university life right now is certainly different than I expected it to be. Universities are under all kinds of pressures, especially in the humanities, and they're really like an endangered species.
And let me ask you, when you decided to make the shift, and you mentioned A Deeper South, but it seems like you laid a lot of cobblestones en route to A Deeper South, whether it was your photo book, your films that you've done in the prelude to this. And I'm wondering what you brought from academia in terms of your own practice, your own research. You said you really liked the research. You came from a theological background and study. What of that background served you well, or maybe was a hindrance and things you had to cast aside as you stepped into your own work that wasn't shaped by provosts and deans of departments and you could cast your own way?
That's a great question. It took me some time to realize, looking back, what was the thing that was connecting A Deeper South with the work I had done in a more strictly scholarly or academic vein. And I didn't really figure it out until I was already into it for a couple of years. And my PhD dissertation, which became a book that no one read, was about memory and about the way memory in the Middle Ages, the art of memory, which was a huge thing, going back to the classical period, shaped the way theological texts were organized. So I was trying to show how certain texts were, particularly in Thomas Aquinas, for example, were organized according to this idea of memory, and that you're actually, while you're proceeding through the text, you're actually enacting a kind of collective memory and participating in this sort of journey into the memory of, in Thomas's case, the memory of the church, the memory of the Christian community.
Is this what you mean by the art of memory? I hadn't heard that term before. Explain that a little more.
Yeah, the art of memory goes back to figures like Cicero, Quintilian, and another anonymous author from the Latin world. Those are the main authorities. Cicero was an orator. So his basic shtick as a lawyer was giving speeches. And in order for Cicero to be able to remember speeches, he used this artificial memory, it was called. And he had this technique where you imagine yourself inside of a house. And in each room of the house, you place a different item that corresponds to a point you want to make in your speech. So let's say you have in the foyer, you have a purse that reminds you that this is a case about theft. And then you go to proceed to the next room, and there's something else that reminds you of like paragraph 2 or the next point in your argument. And so as you're proceeding through this imaginary house, you're at the same time making this speech, constructing a work of oratory while you're performing this act of artificial memory.
How did this at all inform your approach to what ended up as your photo book, The Road to Unforgetting? The connection there obviously is memory, forgetting. And is that something you were mindful of as you were taking these photos, or did that just develop as you then were coming back and revisiting your photos and seeing what the connecting points were? How did the art of memory tie into what turned into your photo book, The Road to Unforgetting?
I think it totally came after the fact for me. When I left academia, I took up some of those things that I felt like the culture of academia had pushed out of my main sort of area of interest, like certain forms of music, photography, certain literature. And yeah, I felt dismembered. This is one way I describe it. And so leaving academia was, in a way, an attempt to put myself back together, to remember myself. And the way The Road to Unforgetting came about was, I think at some point in the past I had this vague notion that maybe I'd do a photography book. I would take enough pictures and I guess you can make a book out of them. But it was only when A Deeper South, the project, emerged in around early 2018, and I went back at this trove of negatives that I had. I had basically contact sheets in some cases and just sleeves and sleeves of negatives.
And you hadn't necessarily planned to do anything with them. They were just in the moment you're traveling, which I want to get to in a moment about your impetus for these travels and the route you took. The subtitle of your book is called Detours in the American South, which I know plays into the title of your podcast, The Detourist. There's a lot of connecting points here. But you were just taking these photos. You were still a professor at Baylor, right? You were there until 2013. These photos date from 97 through 2022, so into the pandemic. So that's a 25-year span. Right. So what was it for you that only decades later did it turn into what came up to be a book?
I think early on when I started, I certainly didn't have a sense of myself as a photographer. I think I just shot pictures I thought looked cool. Maybe there was an attempt to document, but it was really only in going back that I discovered, I think, the power of photography, and particularly film photography. A lot of the photography I did in the first few trips that we took together was naive in the sense that I don't have any formal background in photography. I just follow my instinct, and maybe I'll frame something. I didn't know what rules I was breaking. And when I went back and looked at these negatives starting in 2018, I started to look at my own pictures as differently. They came back to me in a way, and they revealed something that I didn't see the first time.
And these were almost always places, right? That you weren't photographing people very much, right?
Very rarely. Now that you mention that, I was very early on uneasy about photographing people, and I still
Which
am.
is a whole different approach. The entirety of filming people, of shooting people, it's a different kind of intimacy, a different kind of voyeurism, invasion in some cases, or a sensitivity in a way that can come through and be communicated through images with people that isn't necessarily when you're doing the landscape and landmarks and other things. And it seemed you were more comfortable just shooting places and landscapes.
Yes, and absolutely right about street photography. There's a big controversy nowadays about the propriety of street photography. Is it okay to just go out and take pictures of strangers without their permission?
More after this. When you go to an Asheville City Soccer Club game, you're not just watching soccer, you're welcomed into what players and fans call the South Slope Blues.
The South Slope Blues, they're amazing.
This is the coach of the women's team, Brooke Bingham.
The atmosphere is what makes Asheville City Soccer so great.
Longtime player Laura Greb.
We have the most dedicated fans. We have our South Slope Blues. They post up in the corner of the field every game. They've got their drums, they've got their smoke, they've got their loud voices. You can hear them for miles.
Elite men and women players from throughout North Carolina team up in Asheville for a 2-month season against other aspiring pros from all over the Southeast. Home games this season begin May 18th at Greenwood Field on the UNC Asheville campus. For details, tickets, and your first steps into the South Slope Blues, visit Asheville City Soccer Club at ashevillecitysc.com. Tell me if I'm off base here, but I would imagine your academic background in a way was a wall of demarcation that you felt comfortable. It was more of a research-based approach. It was a documentation of your travels and what you observed approach rather than conversations you were getting into. And I would think that it probably didn't even really occur to you to have people be prominently in your photos.
It really didn't. There's an image from our first trip in 1997, which we began in Atlanta and headed south on US 19, US 41 to Plains, Georgia. And I was taking a picture out in front of some of your listeners may remember the Billy Carter service station. Billy, Jimmy's, I think he was his younger brother.
His wayward brother,
the black sheep of the Carter family, who ran a gas station in Plains. It was just deteriorating. There was a marquee out front, and I was taking a picture of a Phillips 66 sign. It's a US 280 that runs through Plains, and there's an African American man walking towards the camera. And I took the picture. I don't really know what I was intending to take it of, but he's walking towards the camera. He's a little bit out of focus, but he's looking directly at me. And that was the last picture of a person I took for a long time. I look back at that image after a separation of 25-something years, and it was something really deeply uncomfortable about it. Not just that am I invading this guy's space, but he was looking at me, like interrogating me. And I started to just really develop a sense of awe over the power of film to communicate over time differently and to reveal something that I didn't see for 20-something years.
And these were still for yourself. You didn't necessarily have an aspiration around it until 2018 when you're going through these negatives. So in the final years of your photography, which extended from 2018 to 2022 is the cutoff, were you also shooting digital movies?
I was shooting digital movies, but not digital still images.
But on your same travels, though, you would go out and do both.
Yeah, do both. So I'd carry, for the photography nerds out there, I have 2 Nikon F3s from the 1980s that are just workhorses. They're not perfect. They're banged up. The viewfinder is damaged. It doesn't even work on one of them. I have to guess the exposure, but they're pretty indestructible. They have a certain look to them. The F3 had electronics in it, but it was the last basically fully mechanical camera that Nikon made.
I guess I was just wondering, though, but without getting into the technicalities of it, what was going on inside you that would inspire you to say, oh, I'm going to pick up my Nikon and shoot some still imagery. Oh, I'm going to take my digital camera and shoot some film. When you reach that fork in the road, what inspired you to go in which one way or the other?
Yeah, I was always carrying the film camera around me, and then sometimes would carry the video camera with me. When I've gotten to a place where I felt there was something, and some of it was just logistical, like we're going to be here for a little bit, so I'm going to shoot some video. And so that first 2018 trip, the first or second night, we were in Fargo, Georgia. And I just took my digital camera out and just started wandering around shooting B-roll, basically, and then just trying to capture the feel of this place. And for me, the way I came to call Deeper South shorts were like 3 to 6 minute, loosely edited, just shot on the fly. There's no agenda, like the detour. There's no map. Just make it up as you go. If you're not familiar with Fargo, it is such a specific place. It is at the bottom of the Okefenokee Swamp, way South Georgia. You can't go any farther south. Very different landscape. And that part of Georgia is just itself kind of magical. The Suwannee River flows right through town, and it's tiny. There's a motel in Fargo called the Gator Motel that has 4 rooms. And I just started filming and then asked the proprietor, his name is Kevin Hart, not the comedian, but a local who runs the Gator Motel, if he would just tell us about the motel. One of the things that really revealed to me was just how ubiquitous these stories are. They're everywhere, and you cannot make this stuff up. And if you only stop long enough to just ask or talk to someone, they just start coming out. At the time, there was an Outfitters there. It's not anymore. And there were like 5 or 6 locals just sitting on the benches in front of this gas station.
That's their job.
That's their job. They are, talk about the guardians of memory of this place. They were just sitting there, and I was like, do you mind if I just film you? And they were like, oh, totally. They could care less.
Oh, wow. That's interesting that you asked. Was this the first time you had ever asked anyone if you could film them?
That was the first time I'd ever asked.
I can imagine you being a little nervous.
I was a little nervous. The only thing that one of those guys said was like, just don't put it on the Facebook, which I didn't. I put it everywhere else.
Now, tell me about your decision to start working on something that turned into your narrative for A Deeper South. You were working in moving pictures and still images. When did you start wanting to put written word down to some of this, and how did that change your approach to your travels?
They really happened simultaneously. I was in Pasadena, California in early 2018. I think it was maybe February or something. Buddy of mine, Tom Zellner, who's a fantastic writer who writes about the road. Tom, by the way, is also an editor for Los Angeles Review of Books. And he really encouraged me to go back on the road and to this time to really be intentional about writing it up.
Which changes a project immensely.
It does.
What were you able to tell in a narrative, in a written narrative, or what did you seek to tell in a written narrative that you felt your photos and films didn't quite capture?
Some of that was I had been learning about my own family's history. And that's really the thing that made this not just a spectator's account of traveling through the South. I got sent to Montgomery by the Christian Century magazine to write about the opening of the lynching memorial there that had just opened in April 2018. And I get there, and the actual memorial was closed, but the bookstore happened to be open, attached to the Legacy Museum, which was right down on Commerce Street in Montgomery. And so I'm browsing the bookstore, and I buy this book called At the Hands of Persons Unknown by Philip Dre. It's about the lynching of Black Americans. And I get this book, and the first page is about the lynching of Sam Hose in Noonan, Georgia in 1899. Okay, obviously I'm finding this guy's name everywhere. I turn the page, and it's Governor Allen Daniel Candler, pro-lynching governor of Georgia from 1898 to 1902.
Did you know about this relative?
I knew him by name. That's it. And this was like a punch in the gut. I had never heard this before. And I know, like, the Candler name it's pretty prominent in Atlanta. And Allen, it would have been my great-great-grandfather's first cousin. I had certainly never heard about his attitude towards lynching, and I'd never even heard about Sam Hose or this episode in 1899.
How did you choose to approach this in your work?
In a way, it wasn't a choice so much as here I am, like, I'm reading the definitive history of lynching of Black Americans, and my family name is on page 2, and I cannot just pretend like I did not just read that.
You pepper your narrative like different chapters of the South and different personal stories, some connected to you, some not. I know you went to the town where Emmett Till was killed, and deliberately to tell a story there that hadn't been really spotlighted very much. Yeah, really, the Emmett Till story has become so central to this book and to my life. Emmett Till, it's this strange paradox, and I think indicative of so much of American memory, particularly white memory. What happened to Emmett Till in 1955 is unspeakably horrible. So what did you want to bring to this? Where did you feel you could come in here with something fresh?
I think what struck me was that this was a case where history is not just something that happened in the past. It has everything to do with the stories we continue to tell about what we think happened in the past. And what got my attention was when John and I were near Glendora, Mississippi in 2018 and driving across the Tallahatchie River where his body was discovered. And we see a sign, this big purple sign. It's like the river site. And it is riddled with bullet holes. And we pull over to look at this thing, and this black man across the street at just one level ranch house is out on his front porch smoking a cigarette, and he comes over and starts telling us about the sign and like how it gets shot up every now and then. And that became one of those short films that I made from that summer. And I found, again, like in Fargo, just this willingness, and it's not just a willingness, it was like an urgency, an eagerness to tell this story. And Terrell was his name, Terrell McAtee, and he started telling us about Emmett Till. And it's right a mile down this road. This gravel road is where they found his body. Two fishermen And it just made me realize that this stuff is alive. Like, it has an urgency to people in this corner of the earth that it doesn't have for people like me, white people of wealth, grew up private school, Buckhead. But this should be in everybody's understanding of this country.
Yeah. So what are you working on now that we can talk about?
Right now, the immediate future is the book tour. It's taken me throughout the South. The cool thing has been that this whole book project, A Deeper South, it's built around road trips. So when we started planning a book tour, it settled into 12 stops in about 3 weeks across the South. And it's exciting for me because I get to go to some of these places that I love and read, talk about them. This is phase one, and this kind of gets at what we're doing next. Is last fall, I guess, we did a screening of some of the short films that came out of my trips. So there's like some of those really short 3 to 6 minute ones, and it includes the Emmett Till one, includes the Fargo one, and then some others that I made mostly around the 2018, 2019 era that grew out of those trips. And I packaged them together as a series of 7 short films. We screened them here at the Grail in Asheville last fall, which was so fun. It was so cool to just have people come watch my movies. It was amazing. And so in the fall, when the academic year kicks back up, we're going to be doing some events like that will include hybrid book reading, workshop, film screening type stuff, and book tour. To me, the interesting thing about all this stuff is like being able to, and I think the sensibility that those little films grew out of was attempted to capture was the specificity of the experience of a particular place at a particular time that cannot be repeated. But because of the nature of the universe, the nature of the world we inhabit, discloses truth indefinitely. And so being able to go do that all over again, it never gets old.
I want to thank my guest today, author, photographer, and filmmaker Pete Candler, for today's conversation. Our conversation happened at the BB Theater in downtown Asheville, which comes to me courtesy of the Asheville Contemporary Dance Theater and Susan and Giles Collard. If you value the Overlook's place in Asheville's media landscape, please consider joining dozens of others who are supporting the show through my Patreon crowdfunding page. Become a member for as little as $5 a month. Visit patreon.com/The Overlook Podcast. Our First Look newsletter gives you just a handful of daily headlines from around the local media landscape to get you on your morning. We also have a weekly newsletter devoted to all things The Overlook that hits you every Friday. Both are free and available at podavl.com/newsletter. The theme song for The Overlook, Maker's Song, comes to us courtesy of the Asheville duo The Resonant Rogues. The Overlook is a production of Podcast Asheville. New episodes come out every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday wherever you get your podcasts. You can find us on any social media channel at AVL Overlook. And I'll see you on the next episode of The Overlook with Matt Peiken.